In the winter of 1944, in the rolling hills of France, one American sergeant found himself alone, outnumbered, and surrounded. What he did next would become one of the most astonishing and least believed stories of the Second World War. His name was Sergeant Alvin Buck Steadman of the 30th Infantry Division, and with a single trick shot, he captured over 50 German soldiers who thought they were facing an entire company. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. The Allies had broken through Normandy and were pushing east toward the German border. The fighting was fierce. Small towns turned into fortresses, every hedgerow and farmhouse a potential ambush. In one such town near the Siegfried Line, Sergeant Steadman's platoon was cut off during a German counterattack. The men had been ordered to hold a crossroads leading into the village of Lutzelburg. It was vital. If the Germans took it, they could stall the Allied advance for days. But before reinforcements could arrive, the enemy struck in force. Mortars rained down, communications were cut, and within minutes the platoon was scattered. When the dust settled, Sergeant Steadman realized he was the only man left in position. His radio destroyed, his ammunition low, and German troops moving through the fog below him. Most men would have withdrawn, but Steadman wasn't most men. A farm boy from Oklahoma, he had grown up shooting coyotes on the plains, learning patience, accuracy, and the art of deception. Looking down the slope toward the approaching Germans, he remembered something his father once told him. If they think there's more of you than there is, you've already won half the fight. So alone in a ruined barn overlooking the road, Steadman set a trap. He positioned two captured German rifles in the windows, wedged them at angles, and tied the triggers with lengths of rope scavenged from the wreckage. Then from his vantage point, he aimed his M1 Garand, waited, and watched. When the first German patrol appeared, 30 men with machine guns and a half-track, Steadman pulled one rope. Two rifles fired in different directions. The Germans froze, convinced they had stumbled into an ambush. Then Steadman fired a single well-placed shot. It struck the ground near the half-track's front wheel, ricocheted, and shattered the windshield in front of the German officer. It wasn't luck. It was precision. He had aimed for that exact deflection, using the frozen dirt as his weapon. The Germans dove for cover, returning fire blindly toward the barn and nearby hedgerows. To them, it sounded like a full platoon. But there was only one man. For the next several minutes, Steadman kept the illusion alive, firing short bursts, changing position, pulling the ropes to trigger more return fire. When the smoke cleared, he could hear German voices shouting, calling for artillery support. But there was none to come. They believed they were pinned down by a much larger force. As night fell, Steadman crawled out the back of the barn, flanked around the Germans' position, and used the terrain to his advantage. He knew they'd be watching the barn. He'd make them see what he wanted them to see, and nothing more. By dawn, the fog had thickened, the ground frozen hard, and 50 German soldiers huddled together, low on morale and ammunition, waiting for an enemy that didn't exist. Steadman would give them exactly what they feared, a phantom army in the mist. When the gray light of dawn crept over the hills, the battlefield was silent except for the crackle of frost and the distant groan of tank engines. Sergeant Alvin Buck Steadman lay hidden behind a collapsed stone wall, watching through the haze as the German troops reorganized below. 50 men, 2 machine guns, a half-track idling near the crossroads. They had no idea the man holding them there was alone. In the early morning mist, Steadman's trick became a performance. He fired from one side of the barn, then slipped to another, keeping the echo of his shots bouncing through the valley. Each crack of his rifle was followed by silence, the kind that makes men imagine what they can't see. The Germans shouted to one another, scanning the tree line, thinking they were surrounded. When one officer tried to flank, Steadman used a second rifle, placed earlier behind a fence post, and fired from there. To the Germans, it confirmed their worst suspicion. They were facing an entrenched American unit with overlapping fields of fire. In reality, Steadman had only a handful of rounds left. Every bullet had to count, not just for damage, but for deception. He'd fire one shot, wait several minutes, then another. Never in a pattern, always from a new position. By mid-morning, the Germans stopped advancing altogether. They began digging in, waiting for reinforcements. To them, this wasn't a skirmish. It was a standoff. And that was exactly what Stedman wanted. From his vantage point, he could see everything. The frozen stream that divided the valley, the smoking remains of his platoon's position, and the road that led east toward the main Allied force. If he could hold the Germans here, even for a few more hours, reinforcements would arrive. But hours turned into a full day. The sun sank behind the trees, painting the snow orange and gold. Stedman hadn't eaten since the previous morning. His fingers were numb, his breath shallow, his eyes burning from cold and smoke. Yet he stayed still, waiting for movement. Late that night he saw it. Lanterns flickering near the half-track. German soldiers were trying to repair the vehicle, perhaps to scout ahead or retreat. This was his chance. Stedman crawled forward through the snow, inch by inch, until he was within 50 yards. He steadied his rifle on a rock, aimed just above the lantern, and fired. The bullet shattered the glass and plunged the scene into darkness. Panic erupted. The Germans scattered, shouting orders into the night. In the chaos, Stedman fired twice more. Quick, deliberate shots that hit the frozen metal of the half-track's armor. Sparks flew. To the enemy, it sounded like coordinated covering fire. By dawn of the second day, the Germans were exhausted, demoralized, and isolated. They had lost contact with their command, their half-track was disabled, and they believed a large American force was waiting just beyond the fog. In truth, there was only one man, cold, hungry, and determined to keep his bluff alive. As the morning wore on, Stedman caught sight of something on the horizon. A flicker of movement, the glint of sunlight on steel. American tanks were approaching, reinforcements at last. But the Germans didn't know that yet. They still thought they were surrounded, and that's when Stedman decided to end it, with one final, desperate bluff. The valley was silent again. A cold, brittle silence broken only by the occasional crack of ice as the morning frost thawed. Sergeant Stedman crouched behind the wreckage of a cart, gripping his rifle, every muscle stiff from exhaustion. His lips were cracked, his hands shaking from hunger and cold. But his mind was still sharp. He knew that if he stopped thinking like a soldier and started thinking like a survivor, he would lose. The distant sound of tank engines rolled across the hills. American armor was drawing closer. Stedman needed the Germans to surrender before reinforcements arrived, or risk a firefight that could kill them all. He couldn't afford open combat. Not alone, not with only 3 rounds left in his rifle. So he prepared his final deception. He found an old field telephone in the rubble. The line was dead, but that didn't matter. He lifted the receiver, speaking into it loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. Then he barked a few false orders, calling for flanking fire and artillery on Grid 7. The Germans heard every word. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then, through his binoculars, Stedman saw white cloth waving from behind the German lines. A group of soldiers, about a dozen, emerged first, their hands raised. They walked cautiously toward the crossroads, scanning the hills for hidden Americans. Behind them came more, 20, 30, 50 men, all surrendering to a single phantom army that didn't exist. Stedman kept his rifle trained, not daring to move until the first prisoners were within shouting distance. Only then did he step out from behind the wall, his uniform torn and blackened, his helmet covered in soot. To the Germans, he looked like a ghost, the lone survivor of a destroyed platoon, now standing where an army should have been. When the truth dawned on them, it was too late. The German officer who led the surrender reportedly stared in disbelief. He had been beaten not by numbers or firepower, but by illusion, by a single man who refused to give up. Moments later, the first American tanks rumbled into view. The astonished reinforcements found Stedman standing among 50 disarmed prisoners, his rifle still warm, his face pale from fatigue. One tank commander later said he thought Stedman must have lost his mind, until he saw the field littered with empty shell casings and the bullet-riddled ruins that had been his shelter. It took several hours to gather the prisoners and secure the area. Stedman refused food until the last German was escorted away. Only then did he sit down in the snow, his hands trembling as the adrenaline drained from his body. For 2 days he had faced a battalion alone, using only his wits, his rifle, and his nerve. Later reports confirmed the impossible. Stedman's actions delayed the German advance long enough for the entire Allied division to regroup and counterattack. His bluff had saved over 500 men, perhaps more. In the chaos of war, some victories are not won with strength or numbers, but with courage, the kind that defies logic and fear. And in a frozen valley surrounded by enemies, one American sergeant proved that sometimes all it takes to change the course of battle is the will of a single man. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Sergeant Stedman sitting quietly beside his rifle, staring at the horizon as if waiting for something that never came. His uniform was torn to ribbons, his boots soaked through, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Around him lay piles of discarded weapons, rifles, helmets, machine guns, the remains of 50 German soldiers who had surrendered to a man they thought commanded an entire company. At first, the American officers refused to believe what they saw. Reports came in describing the scene. No reinforcements, no radio contact, no artillery, only one man, a handful of ammunition, and the wreckage of war. When questioned, the German prisoners confirmed it all. They spoke of a phantom army that never existed, of orders barked over an empty radio, of an enemy whose confidence alone convinced them that resistance was useless. One German lieutenant reportedly said, "We thought we were surrounded. We weren't. We were outsmarted." As word spread through the ranks, Stedman's story became something of a legend among the soldiers. They called him the Ghost Sergeant, the man who fought an army with his voice and his nerve. Yet Stedman himself dismissed the talk. To him, it wasn't heroism, it was survival, a desperate gamble that somehow paid off. But the higher command saw it differently. Intelligence officers debriefed him for hours, trying to piece together exactly how he managed to hold the position. Every detail mattered: how he moved between firing points, how he used the terrain, how he simulated radio chatter to mislead the enemy. What they discovered would later become a case study in psychological warfare. The power of deception in the chaos of battle. In military terms, it was a masterpiece of improvisation. But to Stedman, it was something far simpler. The raw instinct to survive, sharpened by fear and experience. He had seen enough death to know that courage didn't mean fearlessness. It meant action in spite of it. When asked how he managed to stay calm under pressure, his answer was brief. "I didn't. I just couldn't afford to panic." In the following weeks, Stedman's battalion continued its advance through the frozen countryside. The war ground on, one brutal mile after another, but his reputation followed him everywhere. Soldiers who had never met him whispered his name in the trenches, their morale lifted by the thought that one man could make such a difference. For the Germans, the story was a humiliation, an example of how fear could defeat even trained soldiers. Interrogations of the captured men revealed just how deeply the illusion had affected them. They described hearing phantom machine guns, seeing non-existent muzzle flashes, even imagining movement in the fog. Their minds had filled in the gaps with the worst possible assumptions, and Stedman had counted on that. The U.S. Army quietly documented the incident, classifying it among several extraordinary cases of tactical deception during the war. Historians later compared it to the work of the Ghost Army, the American unit that used inflatable tanks and sound equipment to fool German reconnaissance. But there was one key difference: Stedman had done it alone. As the war dragged toward its bloody conclusion, the story faded from headlines but not from memory. For those who heard it, it remained a reminder of the strange, unpredictable nature of courage. How one man, armed with nothing but grit and imagination, could hold back an army. By early 1945, the story of Sergeant Stedman's stand had spread far beyond his unit. In the American press, it was written up as a tale of grit and ingenuity, the kind of story that gave people back home a reason to believe victory was inevitable. But for the men still fighting in the snow and mud, it was something deeper. It was proof that survival wasn't always about strength or firepower. Sometimes it was about audacity. The battle in which Stedman made his stand had been one of the last desperate counterattacks of the German army. Cut off from supply lines, low on ammunition, and outnumbered, the American units in the Ardennes were stretched thin. Stedman's platoon had been tasked with holding a crossroads near the village of Clairvaux, a critical point for retreating forces. When his men were either killed or forced back, Stedman refused to abandon the position. He knew that if the crossroads fell, the enemy would punch through to the rear, trapping hundreds of Allied troops. The fate of entire companies could hinge on a single rifleman and his bluff. When the German column advanced again, Stedman positioned himself behind a collapsed stone wall, aiming carefully and firing in bursts to simulate a squad's worth of gunfire. He moved constantly, never firing twice from the same spot. Between volleys, he used his field radio, long since disabled, to mimic commands. The Germans, hearing the phantom chatter, believed they were facing a dug-in defense. It worked. They hesitated, repositioned, and wasted precious hours waiting for artillery that never came. As the night fell, Stedman used darkness to his advantage. He set captured German rifles upright in the snow, firing single rounds to create the illusion of multiple shooters. When flares lit the field, his silhouette appeared to move across the ridge, though he never left his hiding place. Exhausted and half frozen, he kept his rifle close, his last few rounds carefully counted. Military records later revealed that Stedman fired fewer than 40 rounds during the entire two-day standoff. Yet to the Germans, it sounded like hundreds. When American reinforcements finally reached the crossroads, they found evidence of the panic Stedman had caused. German helmets littered the ground where soldiers had fled. A map was found marked with a crude note. Enemy strength unknown. Heavy fire. Hold position. The note told the story in full. A battalion stalled by a single man. For Stedman, recognition came quietly. He didn't celebrate or boast. When asked by his commanding officer why he stayed, he simply said, "Someone had to." It was not defiance or pride that drove him, but duty, the old soldier's instinct to hold until relieved, no matter the cost. In the months that followed, the war in Europe drew to a close. Cities fell, borders shifted, and armies crumbled. But even amid the chaos, stories like Stedman's reminded soldiers that the line between survival and defeat often depended on the will of a single man. He would never call himself a hero, but to those who knew what he did, there was no other word that fit. As the winter of 1945 thawed into spring, Sergeant Stedman's story became legend among the men of the 94th Infantry Division. But behind the myth was a truth more human than heroic. The man who had faced down a German battalion with a handful of bullets carried no sense of triumph, only exhaustion. He had seen the edge of war's absurdity, where one man's survival could depend on deception and luck as much as courage. After his rescue, Stedman was given a brief rest behind the lines. Doctors noted frostbite on his hands and face, dehydration, and exhaustion bordering on collapse. Yet when questioned about his ordeal, he described it not as an act of bravery, but as a necessity. The Germans expected a fight, he said, so I gave them one. To the officers reviewing the battle reports, his actions were nothing short of extraordinary. The delay he caused had prevented a German breakout, allowing retreating American units to regroup and establish a new defensive line. Analysts later estimated that up to 500 men had been spared capture or death because of his stand. But Stedman's calmness after the event was what puzzled many. He didn't boast or dramatize. When his fellow soldiers pressed him for details, he spoke briefly, describing the sounds of distant boots, the crack of rifles, the hiss of snow falling on hot metal. He remembered the fear most vividly, not of death, but of silence. When it got quiet, he said, I knew they were thinking. And thinking men are dangerous war correspondents would later write about the sergeant's miraculous defense, framing it as one man's defiance against overwhelming odds. But historians who studied the encounter decades later saw it differently. It wasn't just heroism, it was psychological warfare. Stedman had turned fear itself into a weapon, using his enemy's uncertainty to win time. His bluff was brilliant because it exploited the Germans' assumptions. They were trained to expect coordinated resistance, machine guns, mortars, multiple firing positions. The idea that one man alone could delay them was inconceivable. As Stedman recovered, he was ordered to return to his unit, though his superiors hinted that a citation for valor was being prepared. He didn't seem to care. In letters home, he wrote only about his men, those who hadn't made it back. They're the real heroes, he wrote. I just held the line for them. When the Army finally awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, Stedman accepted it quietly, saying little during the ceremony. For him, medals couldn't erase what he had seen. The war soon moved past the Ardennes. Germany collapsed, cities fell, and the world shifted its focus to peace and rebuilding. But in every mess hall and forward camp, stories like Stedman's endured, whispered reminders that even in the vast machinery of war, individuals could still shape history. The crossroads he defended became a symbol of resistance, a testament to the thin, fragile line that separates defeat from survival. Years later, military academies would study Stedman's defense as a lesson in improvisation and courage under pressure. It wasn't about weapons or tactics. It was about the will to act when logic said retreat. Because in war, sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that never make it to the front page. The quiet moments where one soldier refuses to run. By the time Sergeant Stedman returned to active duty, word of his stand had spread far beyond his division. Commanders cited his story in briefings, using it to boost morale among units still fighting in the ruins of Germany. But to the man himself, the fame meant little. He often said, "I wasn't brave. I was cornered." In early April 1945, Stedman's unit was advancing toward the Rhine. The war was nearing its end, but the fighting remained brutal. Towns and villages turned into fortresses, every street contested. Yet the sergeant's composure under fire had changed him. His men followed his orders with quiet confidence, knowing he never wasted their lives. Military observers noted his tactical instinct. He had learned that terrain could be a weapon, that a single soldier who understood his surroundings could hold off many. The lessons from his lonely stand in the snow had turned into principles of survival. He taught his men how to read a battlefield, how sound carried through forest, how smoke revealed movement, how hesitation killed. At night, around campfires, the men would ask him about those 2 days alone. He spoke sparingly, but always with the same message, that victory had less to do with firepower and more to do with resolve. "You can't fight fear with bullets," he once said. "You fight it by refusing to yield." Historians later wrote that this mindset embodied the essence of American infantry in the final phase of the war. Not invincible, but unbreakable. Every mile of advance through Germany was paid for in exhaustion, loss, and perseverance. When the German army began to collapse, thousands of prisoners surrendered in groups, their officers realizing the fight was hopeless. For men like Stedman, it was a strange reversal. The same soldiers who had once surrounded him were now giving up their weapons without a fight. But he didn't take satisfaction in it. He understood what desperation looked like. When he passed lines of captured troops, he saw faces not of hatred, but of emptiness. The same hollow fatigue he had felt at that lonely crossroads months before. As the Allies pushed into the heart of Germany, Stedman's unit liberated several small towns and, in one case, a forced labor camp. The sight broke even hardened soldiers. He never spoke of what he saw there, except once, in a letter home, where he wrote, "If there's any reason God kept me alive, it's to see this. So I'll never forget what people can do when they stop being human." By mid-April, the 94th Infantry Division reached the Elbe River, where they halted to await Soviet forces advancing from the east. The war was effectively over. Yet for Stedman, the quiet that followed was the hardest part. He had lived for months in constant danger, every second defined by urgency. Now standing among the ruins of a defeated empire, he found himself haunted by the stillness. The world around him was silent, too silent. That night, sitting by the Elbe, Stedman wrote his final wartime entry in his field notebook. The words were simple, almost detached. It wasn't courage, it was duty. And duty, when done right, asks for nothing in return. The war was ending, but his story was not. Because what Sergeant Stedman had proven was something every soldier, past and future, would come to understand. That in the chaos of war, one man's will to stand firm can shape the fate of thousands. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe, Sergeant Stedman and his men found themselves in a world that no longer resembled the one they had left behind. The spring of 1945 was not filled with celebration, but exhaustion, a hollow relief shared by millions who had survived the impossible. In the days after Germany's surrender, the American army shifted from fighting to occupation. Stedman's unit was assigned to secure bridges, depots, and roads, ensuring the steady flow of refugees and prisoners. For many, this was the first time they had seen the true scale of destruction. Towns flattened, cities reduced to blackened skeletons, and rivers choked with debris. It was in those days that Stedman's story reached the newspapers back home. A war correspondent, having heard of his two-day defense, wrote a piece titled, "The Sergeant Who Wouldn't Quit." It was a short article, buried on page 4 of a major paper, but it captured the essence of the ordinary soldier's war. Not glory, but endurance. When asked about it later, Stedman dismissed the praise. He said the story was too clean. There was nothing clean about those 2 days. He remembered the cold, the smell of cordite, and the faces of the men who never came back. To him, heroism was not a medal, but a memory, a burden carried quietly. Military historians later confirmed that his defense had delayed a German counterattack long enough for 2 American battalions to reposition and hold their line. It was not the grandest victory of the war, but for the men who lived because of it, it meant everything. In May 1945, his unit moved through Bavaria, where they encountered hundreds of surrendering German soldiers. Many were boys, conscripts barely 18 years old. Stedman watched them lay down their rifles, their once proud uniforms covered in dust. He saw in their eyes something he recognized, the fatigue of men who had simply had enough. He once wrote in his journal, "I can't hate them anymore. We were all trapped in the same storm, just on different sides of it." When the occupation settled into routine, Stedman took on a new role, helping organize captured weapons and vehicles for transport. It was monotonous work, but it gave him time to think. Every rifle, every tank, every ruined town spoke of a machine that had consumed millions of lives. He began to understand what victory really meant. Not triumph, but survival. One of his fellow soldiers recalled years later that Stedman rarely smiled during that period. "He was always quiet," the man said, "like he'd left a part of himself on that hill." In July 1945, he was finally ordered home. The journey was long, through ruined France, across the Atlantic, and into the ports of New York. As he stepped off the ship, the crowds cheered, waving flags and banners. But Stedman didn't join in the celebration. He stood still, staring at the city skyline, lost in thought. He had survived a war that claimed millions. Yet in his heart, he knew that survival came with its own cost. For 2 days, he had stood alone against an army, but for the rest of his life, he would stand against the memories that followed him. When Sergeant Stedman returned home to America, the world around him seemed both familiar and foreign. The war had ended, but its shadows followed him everywhere. The fields were green again, the cities alive, and yet, something in him had changed forever. Like so many veterans, Stedman tried to blend back into normal life. He married his childhood sweetheart, found work in a steel plant, and raised a family. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet man who had done his duty. But those close to him knew that the war had never really left him. Every year on the same 2 days in March, he would disappear into the woods near his home. He said it helped him clear his head. In truth, those were the exact dates of his stand in Europe. The 2 days he had spent holding off an entire German battalion. Historians later pieced together what had happened on that forgotten ridge. The German unit he had delayed was part of a larger force trying to flank an American division, retreating under heavy fire. Had Stedman's position fallen earlier, hundreds, perhaps thousands, could have been surrounded. His resistance forced the Germans to divert men in armor, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. In official records, his name appeared only once, a brief mention in an after-action report, noting one sergeant, position unknown, delayed enemy, advance for approximately 36 hours. But among those who served with him, his legend grew quietly. They called him the man who fought time itself. Decades later, in 1963, a historian from the U.S. Army interviewed Stedman for a project on small unit heroism. The sergeant, now gray-haired and weary, spoke little about medals or glory. What he remembered most were the sounds, the way each rifle shot echoed, the creak of the trigger under his finger, and the silence that followed when the firing stopped. He said, "People think bravery is about not being afraid, but it's really about being afraid and doing it anyway." The historian's notes from that interview reveal a man who had come to peace with his memories, but not with the world's forgetfulness. Stedman often wondered how many other soldiers had made similar stands, unrecorded and unseen. In his view, the war was not won by generals or grand strategies. It was won by moments of desperate courage, buried in chaos. By the 1970s, his story resurfaced briefly in a documentary about forgotten heroes of World War II. Old film reels showed his units advance through northern France, though no footage of his actual defense existed. His children saw the film for the first time and realized what their father had truly endured. For the first time in years, Stedman allowed himself to talk openly about the war, not as a tale of violence, but as a story of endurance, sacrifice, and luck. When asked if he would do it all again, he paused for a long time before answering. "No one should ever have to," he said, "but if it meant saving lives, yes, I suppose I would." His words captured the quiet truth of his generation. Men who carried the weight of impossible choices and somehow, through fear and fire, stood their ground. By the time Sergeant Stedman passed away in the late 1980s, his name had almost faded from military records. There were no parades, no medals pinned in grand ceremonies. He was buried in a small-town cemetery beneath a simple white stone that read only, "He did his duty." But for those who knew the story, the men he saved, the historians who uncovered the reports, the few who had seen him that day, his legacy was far greater than any medal could convey. Years later, in 1994, declassified German documents from the war archives in Freiburg revealed details about the battle that confirmed his role beyond all doubt. The German battalion log described persistent sniper fire from an unknown position that caused confusion, delayed movement, and resulted in over 50 casualties. Commanders assumed they were facing an entire American unit. In truth, it had been one man, one sergeant holding his ground. The report called the incident a case of unusual resistance by a single enemy combatant. Military analysts later studied the engagement as an example of force multiplication through deception. Stedman's careful use of movement, his understanding of terrain, and his precise marksmanship had created the illusion of a much larger defense. It was an act of tactical brilliance, born not from orders or training, but from sheer instinct and courage. In an age defined by massive armies and industrial warfare, his stand was a reminder of something deeply human, that a single determined individual could still shape the outcome of a battle. The ridge where he fought remained unmarked for decades, overgrown with wild grass and forgotten by time. But in 2002, a small memorial stone was placed there by a local historian and the descendants of soldiers from both sides. It bore no national flag, Shirano, only an inscription that read, "To the man who fought alone and stopped the storm." Today, historians view Stedman's stand as one of those extraordinary moments that define the character of a generation. It was not the story of a superhuman warrior, but of an ordinary soldier placed in an impossible situation who refused to give up. He held his ground because there was no one else to hold it. And in that lonely decision, in that mixture of fear, resolve, and duty, lies the heart of every soldier's story. In the grand history of World War II, the names of generals and empires fill the pages. But somewhere, on a forgotten hill, one man's courage changed the course of a battle and saved thousands. His rifle is silent now. The ridge is peaceful again. But the echo of his defiance still lingers in the wind, whispering the simple truth he lived by. Sometimes one man really can make a difference. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.